Okay, so that was the church thing. This is the political quote from a document called the Reconstruction and Development Program, which was drawn up, as you see from the date 1994, it was drawn up by the African National Congress before it became the governing party of South Africa, and it was meant to guide its policies for democratizing our country after our first elections in 1994. And it says that democracy for ordinary citizens must not end with formal rights and periodic one-person, one-vote elections, without undermining the authority and responsibilities of elected representative bodies, such as Parliament and provincial legislatures and local government. The democratic order we envisage must foster a wide range of institutions of participatory democracy in partnership with civil society on the basis of informed and empowered citizens, and facilitate direct democracy. Now, there's a lot in this particular quote that's just worth unpacking a little bit. So first of all, it recognizes that very often democracy ends when you walk out of the voting station, you've cast your vote, hopefully it's a free and fair election, and then as a citizen, you have no more influence until the next 5 years have gone by and you can vote again. And this document says that is not good enough. But democracy must not end with your vote every 5 years. The democratic order we envisage must foster a wide range of institutions of participatory democracy. Institutions of participatory democracy, we will see shortly. One of the most important of those, perhaps the most important, is Parliament itself. And yet we don't, again, usually think that we as citizens have much of a role to play in Parliament. When we talk about a CPLO, a Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, that's exactly what we're trying to do as the church. We're trying to participate through our liaising, through our connection with Parliament, in the work of Parliament. And in some of our countries, that work is facilitated by the country's own constitution. In other places, it's made very difficult, unfortunately. But at a political policy level, this is supposedly how our government wants things to be. Notice also in the second last line there that they talk about a partnership with civil society. So again, that's an interesting and a very positive way that a governing party sees itself as having partnerships with us, with NGOs, with churches, with trade unions, with human rights and civil rights groups, etc. Again, we can question how diligently they have followed through on that intention, but it was there to start with. And then it talks about empowered citizens. Clearly, citizens cannot have any impact in the world of politics and legislation and so on, unless they are empowered with the necessary knowledge, opportunities, understandings, resources, etc. And once again, that is one of the things that we try to achieve within a CPLO context. We are not actually working at grassroots with large numbers of citizens. We don't go and have meetings with thousands of people. But we do, through the church, try to understand what it is that's concerning citizens. And then when we make submissions to Parliament, when we engage with political leadership, we try to bring those concerns forward. Okay, moving on then, we come to this value of participation. I think I heard again Peter John was talking about that this morning. The political quote that I've just used is talking about, in other words, participatory democracy. And here we have the church talking about citizens' participation in public life. This is Pope John the 23rd, writing back in 1963, so 60 years ago. A natural consequence of people's dignity is unquestionably their right to take an active part in government. So there's that notion of an active part in government, which to me echoes very much what was said in the Reconstruction and Development Program that I just quoted from, that it is seen as more than just voting every 5 years, but people must take an active part and participate in the way that things are run. And this, in the church's eyes, is seen as a matter of service. This right to take part in the government opens out a new and extensive field of opportunity for service. Service seeking the common good. Very much a similar sort of idea. We don't, as church, go into the world of politics for political reasons. We certainly don't go into the world of politics to promote one or other political party or ideology or anything. We are trying to serve what? The common good. Okay, and hopefully we meet with a kind of cooperation from the world of politics, where politicians also, if they are well motivated, even though they work within fields of ideology and party policies and so on, and left wing and right wing and etc., hopefully their motivation, their basic motivation, is to serve the common good. Right. This brings us then to the Constitution. Now, when I say the Constitution, I mean the South African Constitution. And I know very well that not all constitutions are the same, and they have different provisions when it comes to citizens' participation and the mechanisms for participation. You will find something very, very similar to this in the Namibian Constitution, and that's partly because we stole it from the Namibian Constitution, which was written 2 years before our Constitution. And then you will find something very similar in the Kenyan Constitution of 2010, which borrowed from our Constitution. I think also in the Zimbabwean Constitution of 2010, there are similar provisions and so on. And this is just as a little bit of an aside for those who are interested in constitutionalism stuff. Remember that the constitutions are not copyright. No law that is passed by a government is ever copyrighted. And it's a very important way in which constitutions are developed is precisely by, if you like, stealing or borrowing from each other. When a country sits down to create a new constitution for itself, it would be very stupid if it ignored all the other constitutions. So the constitutional scholars go off and they look at a range of other countries and they say, well, what did they put in their constitution? They look for similar sorts of countries that maybe are facing similar challenges or at similar points on their development politically. And they see what looks good, what do we think will work in our context, and then they import that into the constitution. So section 42 of our constitution here in South Africa says the National Assembly is elected to represent the people and to ensure government by the people under the constitution. And it does this in 3 ways: by providing a national forum for public consideration of issues, by passing legislation, and by scrutinizing and overseeing executive action. In other words, the action of the ministers, the government ministries, the president, etc. So those are the 3 tasks that are given to Parliament by our constitution. We're very, very familiar with the task of passing legislation. Everybody knows that parliaments make laws. We're perhaps a little bit less familiar with the task of overseeing executive action, because the unfortunate fact is that in most countries, parliaments are quite slow to criticize their own leaders. And again, in most of our systems, it wouldn't be the same, for example, in the United States, but in most of our systems where we have inherited more or less a British version of Westminster Parliament, where the winning party or the biggest party supplies the ministers and the president of the country, those that remain behind in Parliament of the same party are very slow to hold their seniors to account in their party. So, I mean, you would see that with ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. You definitely see it with the ANC in this country. You won't find ANC members of Parliament giving President Ramaphosa a hard time when he comes there to answer questions. Yeah. So this oversight of executive action is an absolutely crucial area of Parliament's work, but it's probably one where it falls down to some extent. And then the third one, the first one mentioned there, the National Forum for the Public Consideration of Issues. Well, Parliament is supposed to be open to hear what our issues are, what is concerning the citizens of the country. It should, in a proactive way, create spaces and opportunities for debates on these issues. And all of our countries, as we know, are full of pressing issues. It might be climate change, it might be levels of crime, levels of unemployment. It could be problems of xenophobia, the way that we treat foreigners in our midst. The question that you raised this morning about Lesotho and land, and the feeling amongst many of the Mosotho that parts of South Africa actually belong historically to the Basotho people. That's the sort of thing that the Basotho Parliament could organize a public debate on, a public consideration. How often do our parliaments carry out that role? Not, in my experience, not very often. But nevertheless, this is what the Constitution prescribes should happen. And it goes on to tell us how it should happen. In section 59, this is called public access to and involvement in the National Assembly. And those words, involvement in, are very, very important. Physical access to Parliament is one thing. And again, I know that in some countries in Africa, you cannot get very near the Parliament at all. You're going to come up against soldiers and security barriers and all sorts of things. You might have to make an appointment or an application to a member of Parliament or to the parliamentary staff or somebody for permission to enter the building. In other parts, it's much, much more open. In Namibia, for example, you can walk into your parliamentary buildings. In South Africa, you can walk into the buildings, not at the moment because of the fire that we had. The building is more or less closed for safety reasons, but Parliament sits in other venues around Cape Town at the moment, and you can go there. You don't have to be invited. You don't have to make an application. You just arrive with your identity book and you fill in a little form and off you go. And that varies in different parts of our continent and different parts of the world. But that is physical access. What's more important, in a way, is this question of involvement. So let's just read through what this section says. The National Assembly must facilitate public involvement in the legislative and other processes of the Assembly and its committees. I want to draw your attention to particular words there. First of all, the word facilitate. It does not say the National Assembly must allow or permit public involvement. It puts a positive duty on the National Assembly. You must facilitate. You must be proactive in involving the public. So there is a duty placed on our Parliament to find ways of involving the public. Not just to respond politely when the public ask. They have to do more than that. Then it's in the legislative and other processes. And we saw what those other processes are a minute ago. It's oversight and scrutiny over the executive and the National Forum for the consideration of issues. So once again, Parliament has to find ways of involving us as the public in its oversight duties, its public consideration duties, as well as its lawmaking duties. If you think about it, that is a very heavy load or level of expectation that our Constitution places on Parliament. And note also the word committees. So it's not just the overall work of the National Assembly as one big institution, it's also its committee work. And as I'm sure you know, most of the important work in Parliament takes place in the committees that are dealing with the particular portfolios, foreign affairs or social development, finance, defense, police, etc. Okay, subsection B then goes on to say that the National Assembly must conduct its business in an open manner and hold its sittings and those of its committees in public. So once again, your right as a member of the public to go into the building and sit there in the committee room and listen to what is being said. You cannot necessarily talk. There is a limit to this public engagement. So that's the rule. You can be there, you can hear, you can observe. And if there are public hearings, then you can speak when you are asked to deliver your submission. There are a couple of exceptions to this. Reasonable measures may be taken to regulate public access, including access of the media to the assembly. There would be times when there's just a limited number of people. For example, the big things, the budget speech, the opening of Parliament speech, then you have to get a ticket because they need to control the numbers, obviously. That's fair enough. And you can provide for the searching of people, or even, where appropriate, the refusal of entry. So if someone wants to come into Parliament and they're carrying a big knife, you say, no, sorry, you can't come in for obvious reasons. And I suppose, people who are coming there purely to demonstrate or to disrupt in various ways, who are arriving there with big banners, Parliament may also say, no, this will be disruptive of the proceedings. What exactly is reasonable there? Well, that could be up for debate. But also, subsection 2 of this whole quote says the National Assembly may not exclude the public from a sitting of a committee unless it is reasonable and justifiable to do so in an open and democratic society. So there's a test given by the Constitution. The public may only be excluded if it is reasonable and justifiable to do so in an open and democratic society. And over the years, our courts have given meaning or content to those words reasonable and justifiable and open and democratic. They are thresholds that have to be met. So, for example, the mere fact that members of the public are going to hear politicians making fools of themselves is not a good enough reason to exclude. That's not reasonable to exclude the public. But on the other hand, if a parliamentary committee is sitting to consider some matter which is genuinely of national security importance, so for example, the National Intelligence Committee often or almost always is closed to the public, because it's dealing with national intelligence questions, we understand. On some occasions, the Defense Committee, for similar reasons, will be closed to the public. They may be disclosing information about the strength of the defense force or some problems with the defense force, which, if our country had any enemies, could be useful to those enemies. The real experience in South Africa, I'm happy to say, is that our parliamentary committees are hardly ever closed to the public. They are 99% of the time open. And it has become a habit. It's become the normal routine thing to do, which is how it should be. But I suspect that it's probably the country in the world, perhaps together with Namibia and Kenya, which is the most open, the easiest for people to enter and sit and watch. Even in some of the so-called established democracies in Europe, it's a much more difficult process to get into Parliament. Right. So just to finish on this, Section 72 of the Constitution says exactly the same thing, word for word, for the other house. We've got two houses, National Assembly, National Council of Provinces, and then there are further sections of the Constitution which say the same thing for our provincial legislatures and also for our municipal councils. So even down to the smallest town council in the country, openness is the key thing. Citizens can come and sit and watch the mayor or the town councillors debating the local issues. Openness and transparency are the values. Okay, so this is all, those are the constitutional underpinnings, you might say, of this thing that we call participatory democracy. And I'll link it back to the third slide that I showed you from Pope John the 23rd, where he links our human dignity, our God-given human dignity, to our right and our duty to participate in the world of politics, in the way that decisions are taken that affect us. So participatory democracy is a process emphasizing the broad participation of constituents in the direction and operation of political systems. The roots of democracy demos and kratos, imply that the people, that's demos, are in power, kratos is power, and thus that all democracies are participatory. However, traditional representative democracy tends to limit citizen participation to voting and leaves the actual governance to politicians. And I always quote a certain example of that. Way back now, soon after we started, in fact, I think it might even have been before we started this office, but it was in the later part of the 1990s. One of the first things that the new government did was to review the South African Defence Force, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and to say, what have we got and how do we need to change it? And unfortunately, as a very naive new government, they fell into the hands of the arms dealers of the world, from Britain and France and Italy and Germany and America and so on, who wanted to sell us lots of very expensive military equipment, which we did not need. But the new government was fooled, in my opinion, into thinking that this would be fantastic and makes them look very important when they, have these submarines and fighter jets and all sorts of things in the country. It makes every politician feel like they are really achieving something. So they went ahead with this thing called the Defense Review. And many, many NGOs and civil society organizations participated in this review, making submissions, making our voices heard. And on one occasion, we had a big meeting in Parliament, in the main chamber of Parliament. We were invited in. It wasn't a sitting of Parliament per se, it was a public consultation with government on the one side and members of Parliament and civil society on the other. And the civil society representatives, one after the other, were objecting to the plans to spend many, many billions of rands on these things. And at a certain point, one of the government ministers, who was getting more and more kind of cross and frustrated, stood up and he shouted across at all these citizens, "Who elected you?" And it's not a bad point. Okay? He was saying this government was elected by 70% of the population in the 1994 elections, or maybe 66 or 67%. Overwhelming majority of the people of South Africa in a free and fair election elected the ANC to be the government. No one has ever elected me to work in the CPLO. You know how it works in civil society. We kind of sometimes appoint ourselves. We start an organization ourselves, or the bishop or somebody says, "Hey, I want you to go and do this sort of thing." There's no real democratic election or creation of most civil society organizations, something that we need to be quite aware of. So he was, in a sense, throwing back at us this question of democracy. But of course, his position is also, in my opinion, limited, because the whole idea of participatory democracy is you don't have to be elected to a public position in order to have a say. You have a say in these things by virtue of the fact that you are a citizen. Yeah? And as we've seen, that is called for politically in terms of our constitution. It is also called for theologically in terms of our social teaching, as we understand it, flowing from our human dignity. We should not, as that Reconstruction and Development Program quote that I gave you said, we should not undermine the authority of our elected representatives. We must honor and acknowledge and respect the fact that they have been elected. Of course, I'm assuming we're in a situation of free and fair elections. If they have been duly elected in a legitimate election, we must respect that fact and not undermine them. Because if we undermine them, we're undermining the people who voted for them. But at the same time, we want more than simply good representatives. We want to participate. We want to take part. And that's what participatory democracy is about. It strives to create opportunities for all members of a political group to make meaningful contributions to decision-making and seeks to broaden the range of people who have access to such opportunities. In that quote, their political group doesn't mean political party. It means where you fit in nationally, provincially, locally, or whatever. So the political group let us say, of people who live in Cape Town must have opportunities to contribute to the decision-making of the City Council of Cape Town. But we also live here in the Western Cape Province. So that's our bigger political grouping. We must be able to participate there as well, and of course, nationally as well. Okay. Another way of looking at participatory democracy is that it is a kind of democracy not limiting participation of citizens to voting, but striving to create opportunities for everyone to make meaningful contributions to decision-making. So I think that that point is fairly well made. I want to show you two sort of graphic representations of how this should work. And we'll actually be seeing these drawings again tomorrow, I think, in one of the presentations. Yeah. Get rid of that. That better? Yeah. Okay. So in a well-functioning democracy, right in the center, you have your parliament and your organs of government, all the various different organs of government, ministries, government institutions, the presidency, and all of those things. But they are always being pulled in certain directions by what I've called there the forces of influence, the wider red circle around the outside. Those are the forces of influence. Some forces of influence have an agenda which favors sectoral interests. Other forces favor the common good. Now, this is, I'm oversimplifying things. So it's probably more complicated than this. But in general terms, we can say that political constituencies, ideologies, for example, businesses and industry and commercial forces, many different geopolitical forces, as we see very much now with the Russia-Ukraine war and the way that countries are being forced or encouraged to take some sort of side in that whole question. And then international governments, in other words, other governments that put pressure on our governments. All of them are trying to exert a force for their own benefit, ultimately for their own benefit, okay? Not necessarily for the common good. On the other side, civil society organizations and the faith community, we hope, are trying to exert pressure for the common good, in favor of the common good. They should be, right? If they're not, there's a problem with them. But human rights organizations and women's organizations and development organizations and people working with small-scale farmers and people working for a better environment, all of these things ultimately are aiming for the common good. So there's this tension. Parliament and the organs of government are feeling this pull from both directions. If they manage to resist the tension, then we say that the forces of influence are balanced. No one is pulling government to either side. But if not, what tends to happen, and it's usually this way, is that those with the sectoral interests end up having a stronger influence on government. Okay? They've got money, business interests, political constituencies. They've got power. You know, again, international governments, geopolitical forces, and so on. They have the resources that we don't have in civil society. That's why many of you probably have heard of this thing that happened in South Africa called state capture. When President Zuma came to power, very soon after that, he found himself falling very much under the influence of this side. Business people, in particular, corrupt business people, who were able to basically bribe him and his ministers and start to take over important parts of the government, even to the point where they told him who to appoint as ministers. And when those people were appointed as ministers, they sent in their own advisors to work with those ministers. So there was a classic example, in that case, of business interests and to some extent political constituencies capturing government and pulling it more onto their side. Participatory democracy is about giving us as civil society the strength and the influence to keep the whole thing in the correct balance. Right? We're never going to get rid of the threat from the blue side there. It's always going to be there. So we have to work hard, you might say, to keep that pull, to keep that influence in the other direction. Okay. A few details here about the South African parliamentary process, just to show how you can participate. This is pretty much when it comes to new legislation, but also policy documents that may be considered in the National Assembly. Generally speaking, you start off with, at a policy level, with things like a green paper or a white paper, or a task team is appointed by government to look into a particular problem, or there's some sort of a review is published. And in that process, there is usually an opportunity for public input. So it'll be advertised that the government is undertaking an internal review about a particular law or policy. Yeah.
Can you just go slowly? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, try to be really slow.
Okay.
You can even study from again this.
Yeah, right. A green or a white paper, those are government policy papers. You first get a green paper, which is a kind of a draft version, and the white paper is the final version. If government says, okay, we are going to investigate, we're going to draw up a green paper, let us say on the effect of climate change on agriculture. They will put a group of experts together, and hopefully that group of experts then will consult with anyone who's interested to make an input of some kind. Once they've done that consultation, they draw up a final document called a white paper. And that white paper then may be or will be adopted by the cabinet because it's a policy thing. But it may also be discussed in Parliament so that the political parties have another opportunity to give their input to it. And at each of those levels, there's usually an opportunity in our system for some sort of public input to go on. And as I said, task teams and internal reviews are much the same sort of thing, just different words really. But it's all about opportunities to say something about a challenge or a new area that needs to be dealt with. Just remember, you're going to get copies of all of these slideshows, so you don't have to worry about taking too many notes. Then it will often be that this process of coming up with new policies or of reviewing existing policies will tell us that we need to change the law, maybe come up with a new law or amend an existing law. And so you then go through the legislative stages. There's a draft bill which is written and submitted for public input. So it's advertised on Parliament's website, government websites, in the newspapers, sometimes even on the radio and television, if it's important enough. And you're given a date. So you must make submissions by the 30th of September or whatever. Then it goes back to the government, to cabinet, who review all of these inputs, and the next stage of the drafting, it's written now as a bill, and a bill is tabled in Parliament. These stages and these terms just happen to be how we do it. It's not special. Different parliaments have slightly different systems, but they all amount to the same sort of thing ultimately. It's given a first reading, which is the formal introduction of the new piece of law into Parliament for debate. Tagging simply means it is decided whether this is a law which involves the provinces, or the country as a whole, there are slightly different ways of dealing with it. Does it start in the National Assembly or does it start in the National Council of Provinces? It's not important to understand the distinction, and very few people do. Then it goes here to the committee stage. That's the most important thing. That's very much where the main public input takes place. The committees, again, in case anyone doesn't know, the Committee of Parliament is made up, or a portfolio committee, is made up of representatives of the different political parties who are in Parliament in proportion to their strength in Parliament. So all of the committees in our Parliament have a majority of ANC members, and then a few Democratic Alliance members, and then one or maybe two EFF members, and then the tiny parties might get one or two or three places on the committee. So they're all dominated by the two big parties.
So is that fair?
Yeah.
Is that democratic?
It's democratic.
There's a question which I asked somebody last week, in regard to the leaders of these portfolio committees. Not most of them, all of them, they must be from the ruling party.
Not must be, but they are.
But you find that most of them are from that side. So I'm trying to figure out, is it democratic this way?
Well, I can't say it's not democratic because the governing party has won the majority of the votes. Yeah. But most people would argue, I think most people who value parliamentary democracy would say it's a good idea to share out the duties of chairperson amongst the different parties. For example, in Britain, you will find in the House of Commons, many of the committees are chaired by members of Parliament from the opposition parties. There's one committee in our Parliament which is not chaired by an ANC person, and that is the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, what's called SCOPA. That's the committee that checks how government is spending the money. And there's a very strong tradition that it should not be a government member of Parliament who chairs that committee. So at the moment, it's chaired by someone from the Inkatha Freedom Party. Okay. But yeah, there has been a call recently, in fact, the Zondo Commission into state capture. One of the recommendations that Judge Zondo made was that the chairpersonship of parliamentary committees should be shared out amongst all the political parties, so that it's not all within the control of one party, even if that is the majority party. And I think that's a very sensible suggestion. Unfortunately, it was rejected by the ANC.
The reasons for that.
Yeah.
In case that process fails, will the public be able to petition against what has been decided by the Parliament?
Yes, you certainly can do that. I haven't put it in there, but it comes, there are various ways towards the end. So the public makes their submission to the parliamentary committee. We go there, we engage with, we'll talk about this a bit more tomorrow. We make an oral submission or a written submission. That can go on for a very long time, by which I mean many years in some cases, because if the committee decides to change the bill, the cabinet or the cabinet minister responsible can say, whoa, I'll take it back. I'm not happy with your changes. Let me reconsider. And that process can take years. And then he comes later on, 2 or 3 years later, and brings it back to Parliament. So there can be a lot of to and fro. There's also consideration by the National Council of Provinces. Every law in this country must go first to the National Assembly and then to the National Council of Provinces. It must be passed by both houses. And at both houses, you can have public input. Right? And if the National Council of Provinces makes changes, it has to go back to the National Assembly so that they can approve or reject those changes. And they can once again at that point be public input. If a bill is changed substantially, then we as the public have a right to comment on the changes, right? Because now it's different from the one that we commented on a few months or a couple of years ago. So you can have repeated public input all the way through this process. Then eventually Parliament passes it, and they send it to the president to sign it into law. At that point, you can petition the president, and it does happen, and say, we think that this bill is unconstitutional, or it's not the right moment to sign such a law, or whatever. It doesn't usually work, really. There are one or two occasions that I can mention to you where the president has indeed refused to sign a bill under public pressure, but doesn't happen very often. No.
Just in addition to that one, I think in Zimbabwe, the PVO, Private Voluntary Organization bill, which was supposed to have been signed by the president a long time ago, was never signed. And
yes.
Only last week he retained it to the parliament for further consideration, because we as churches and civic organizations, we were against it so much.
Yeah.
Even the cabinet minister took it into consideration. Despite that, we held many meetings which they tried to convince us with the Attorney General, but finally it was retained last week. And so we are looking at it to come back again to the public.
That's very good news. I'm very happy to hear that. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to understand from you who are the public in this? Are they the elite? Like those who can maybe go to the website of the parliament?
Yeah. To an extent, yes. No matter how hard Parliament tries to be open and accessible, it will always require some degree of sophistication and resources to participate in the work of Parliament. If you want to physically engage, you have to come to Cape Town, which immediately is difficult for most people in the country. Cape Town is situated right at the bottom, in one corner of the country. Or as you say, you have to have internet access. You need to be able to get onto a website. Once you're on the website, you need to be able to read what it's about. And that pretty much means English. Okay? We have a policy that all legislation must be published in at least 2 official languages. But that means English and one other. So it doesn't really help very much if you can't speak English. You may be lucky enough to be able to read one of the other 11 languages. So there are definitely problems of accessibility. To me, that makes our work even more important as civil society, because we become then a kind of a bridge or an instrument that people can use to gain access and information that they would otherwise not be able to have. So I always think it's important when, and we'll talk about this again a bit tomorrow, we'll talk about the basics of advocacy. When we do advocacy, we're not doing it for ourselves. We're certainly not doing it for the Catholic Church. We're trying to do it for the common good, and we need to be aware of what the common good is if we're going to succeed in it. Yeah.
From what you have said, Mike, I want to find out, in law there is a principle that says a law that not is applicable is null and void. Then relating to this, that the Constitution says public participation, but as you are saying that the people, they cannot participate because of the distance of Parliament, like in Cape Town, are saying that. So do you think that is a fair democracy?
Well, it's not perfect, but fair, yes. Remember, people, it's not the law or the Constitution that is creating an obstacle for people's participation. It's physical things and resources, lack of resources, money, etc. But there are many, many, many examples of where even poor communities have managed to get together enough money to send a representative to Cape Town to come to Parliament, put forward their point of view. They do that. Absolutely, they do. Yeah, yeah. Or NGOs do it on their behalf. An NGO will, maybe working on the other side of the country. And they will then bring members of those communities to Cape Town and take them to Parliament and help them through the processes. Okay, so we would all want to see more of that happening, but I think I can say that enough of it happens to make the system a genuine system. It's not just on paper. It does work in practice. Last one, and we must move.
Just to address something we are discussing. We have these are public debates, of which I took advantage of them. That where once particular matters are going to be discussed in Parliament, I would send the information to different communities or maybe to our dioceses. And people would try to participate, and they would join those public debates. Even priests are very much willing to join them. Unfortunately, of late, the ruling party would rather invite and allow their own people and bar, unfortunately now, people they don't know. That was so interesting. I don't know how they made it anyway. And they managed to go with other laws through that way, unfortunately.
No, that's unfortunate. It happens.
I have a question. Rather than, because I think now what you're talking about now is voluntary, bringing the people to Parliament through NGOs, this and that.
Yes.
Why can't the government create that opportunity in every province? That in KZN, maybe once a year or how many times they will provide these, the people they come and sleep here, this and that. Why is that not happening?
That does happen. Again, we would like it to happen more than it does, but it does happen that Parliament takes a decision to say, all right, we will move from Cape Town as a committee and go and sit in different parts of the country. One example where they did that very extensively was some laws around traditional leadership, chiefs and so on, chiefs' courts, the traditional courts bill, etc. The relevant parliamentary committee held hearings in all the provinces, in more than one in each province, in some of the deep rural areas where the people are living under traditional authorities. So that has happened on a number of occasions. Of course, it is a very, very expensive business, and the parliamentary budget is never as high as it should be, but it does happen.
Thank you. I wonder if you could share us the position and the practical experience of the CPLO and the parliamentary process.
Yes, I will, but tomorrow. With that session that you see tomorrow afternoon, which is submissions, publications, and events. I'll talk about it when we talk about submissions. Okay, just to finish off with a couple of slides. This one, participating in public policy means lots of different things, and we could speak at length about almost all of these, but just to note, for example, engagement. There is a value to sitting down and talking to people, in this case, members of parliament, or a deputy minister, or if you're lucky enough that you can get an engagement with the minister or something like that. They might not accept everything that you say. In fact, it's most unlikely that they will accept everything you say. But the fact that they listen to you builds some sort of a relationship, and it's a relationship of accountability and reciprocity. So simply letting them know that we care about what they are doing and that we want to participate in the process is a very important part of building a participatory democracy. Engaging with people. Offering expertise is another area which I think is quite overlooked. Civil society, if you think about it, there are thousands of civil society organizations active in every field that you can think of: health, education, rural development, women and children's rights, environment. The list goes on and on and on. How much expertise is there in the combined knowledge and experience of civil society? It is massive. It's much bigger than the expertise that governments have. individual governments, right? We should be offering that expertise. You think about it, what does the church do up and down Africa? It runs schools. Tens of thousands of schools in Africa are run by the Catholic Church. Similarly, clinics and hospitals, universities, right? Again, the list goes on and on. We need to find ways through our participatory democracy of saying to the government or to parliament, parliamentary committees, we can offer you assistance, expertise, insights, our experience. Okay, we're not just going there to demand that they do things because we want them to do things. We can help them too. Right? We can give them something positive. Holding to account, as I've already mentioned, to a certain extent, accountability and engagement go together. But it's more than that. It's also going to Parliament and saying, well, we're not happy with what is proposed in this law. And you, who are proposing it, need to give us an account of why. Why do you want to do this thing, which we think is bad or not in favor of the common good? Right? So participatory democracy is an accountability mechanism. Then there's the question of monitoring implementation. We make a new law. We adopt a new policy as a country. And then what happens? We move on to the next new law or new policy. And we ignore the question of whether the old one is being implemented properly or not. Now, parliaments love to make laws. Governments love to make new laws. It's easy to make laws. You write some things on paper, you have a big debate in parliament, president signs it. It's much more difficult. It's much more difficult to make sure that the hospitals are running properly, or that the streets are maintained properly. That's really hard work. So we must always be we must be very aware of the need to monitor the implementation. When you have made a submission to Parliament on a particular law, don't forget about it. Try to track and trace what is being done with that law over the years. And if necessary, you can go back to Parliament or to the Parliamentary Committee and say, 3 years ago, you told us we need this new law in order to achieve ABC. You haven't achieved ABC. What's going wrong? All right. And then the last two things very much go together, criticizing the bad and affirming the good. And I'll talk about this again, I think it comes up again tomorrow. But just to say, we have a habit in civil society of criticizing government. And usually it's because government deserves the criticism. But governments also do good things. Some governments more than others, but they do good things. And it's necessary to affirm that also and to praise them when it is due and to have a positive attitude, not always to be negative and complaining. If you complain all the time without any variation, people stop listening to you. This is just what I think is sometimes a useful analogy that you can use when you're talking about these things with people. Imagine a brand new football field, which is nice and level. The grass is cut. The white lines are painted. There's new posts and nets are there. The ball is there. The referee is there. That's like South Africa was 1994. New election, democracy. It's all perfectly sparkling and wonderful. Yeah. And all of the African countries that received their independence in the 1960s and the 50s from the colonial powers, it's all brand new. Life is waiting. But if we don't use it, the lines fade away, the nets rot away, someone steals the ball, the referee goes home because he's got no work to do, and the field becomes useless for its purpose. That is what happens, unfortunately, in many places with our democracies. We have that election, we open a parliament, we've got these opportunities for public participation, the procedures are there, and we as the citizens aren't there. We don't take an active part in it. And what happens? Parliament closes itself and says, well, we keep advertising for public hearings and nobody comes. Why are we wasting our time advertising? And we'll stop advertising public hearings. and they will just pass the laws without public consultation. Opportunities to participate will shrink, politicians will become unaccountable, and then democracy is no longer serving its purpose. It's like a soccer field that has become overgrown and useless. And as I say, if that happens, it's not the politicians' fault. It's our fault. We would have only ourselves to blame. So finally, participation in public policy is the articulation of public opinion into government programs, structures, and legislation. And CPLOs help to form public opinion and then to place it before those responsible for policy and legislation. Okay, any questions before we take a short tea break?